First of all, I would say, and that's still, I think, a relevant point, compliance to regulation, especially in parts of the world, Denmark, the European context, would certainly fit in here, where governments are quite proactive in establishing a framework of rules and regulations and incentives for business to behave more sustainably. And as we see with, for instance, the Volkswagen scandal, that compliance is still a tall order for companies. So I think that's the first point. The second one, I would say that companies within their normal business operations still have a lot of low-hanging fruits which they can pick. What I mean by that is that they still can realize a lot of cost savings by using less energy, producing less waste, by being proactive with regard to their employees, and a whole host of other things where they can either cut costs, look for new areas of revenues. Environmentally friendly products are a good example. Electric cars, hybrid cars are probably the more recent example. And I think that's still something where companies have a lot to do and can have a lot to think about, where they also can stimulate consumer demand for more sustainable lifestyles and products. And ultimately, I think the role of corporations can also be to promote a sustainability agenda, to lobby governments, but that also very much depends whether sustainability is in their economic interest. The role of government is something, certainly the sustainability discourse in business schools often skims over. Government is seen as red tape, as a restriction, as an extra burden on business. But if you look historically how the agenda of sustainability in business has been incentivized and advanced, we have to say that countries and regions of the globe where governments took a proactive stance are actually those who are leading. I mean, the most funny example is indeed the US, which today wouldn't be considered as leading in this field of business and sustainability. But if you go back to the 1970s, when Nixon set up the EPA, the US were leading in many of the then hot environmental topics, and look at the introduction of cleaner automobiles, the catalytic treatment of exhaust fumes. That happened in the US in the 1970s, and Europe came onto that bandwagon 15, 20 years later. So that's a good example, but if you look closer to home here in Europe, in Denmark, if you look at the green energy revolution, that is very strongly based on government incentives, but also government restrictions, new emission standards. We have seen a whole host of progress. If we think of waste management in Europe, this would not have happened to this degree without EU directives and the countries following suit with regulation. Civil society, the third player in the game next to business and government, plays an interesting role, I would say, because in many ways what companies can do if they are looking for opportunities, if they are looking for ways to brand them in a more sustainable way, of course assume that civil society is looking for these features and would not only like companies to be more sustainable, but would also reward that by their decisions in front of the supermarket shelf, right? But historically what we see is that the civil society, in terms of espoused preferences, doesn't necessarily follow suit once they are actually opening their wallets. So in that sense, civil society, I think, has the strongest role to play in building up pressure, in building up discourse around certain issues, and push most notably governments, and then by that token also business to move into a more sustainable direction. Business schools have to play a very important role here because the key actors, if we think of sustainability in business, have to receive an adequate training in this area that pertains first of all to the issues. You know, students, future business leaders have to understand basic things about the environment, about the central challenges. Climate change would be one example at the moment, but we can talk about biodiversity and other issues, also issues more in the social side of sustainability. What is the role of business in human rights? I think these issues have to be discussed because they are relevant to business as much as, you know, expertise in finance, marketing, and strategy. So I think that's a very important role business schools have to play. The interesting and certainly contentious side of the debate, of course, is the question, what are the obligations of business? Is there, beyond compliance and beyond seeking profits and being economically successful with regard to sustainability issues, is there an obligation in itself for companies to be more sustainable? And that's a contentious question. It depends who you ask in a business school, who would say, no, beyond profit maximization, there's no role for business to play. Whereas others would argue that business, by dint of its size, its influence, its power, has an independent moral obligation to advance this agenda. And there are examples out there. If you think of companies like Unilever, and there are a number of Danish companies in that spot too, where business leaders see themselves in a role that it falls to them to lead into a direction which is not just something business should do because there are economic reasons to do so, but because it's the right thing to do. If we talk about progress in sustainability, the answer has to be yes. We have seen massive changes in business. Most major businesses today report on their sustainability, have departments, have implemented a language and an organizational structure around these things. So in that sense, I think we have seen quite some remarkable changes in business. I would say the limits of what business can do, of course, come from the fact that business is set up with a certain economic purpose. That's the constraints in which business is operating. And in that sense, of course, we can say that if you look at the big issues, let's talk climate change again, biodiversity, exploitation of global fisheries. I mean, there are a number of sustainability arenas where the picture is pretty bleak. And in all of these arenas, corporations are not only key players, but also key contributors to exacerbating these problems. And that has to do with the fact that if business is set up the way it is set up right now, as shareholder governed, owner dominated, and mostly in most jurisdictions with the purpose to generate profits, there are limits to what you can do as a business. Because at the end of the day, many of these issues need to a change in fundamental ways of organizing mobility, of lifestyle choices. And corporations, certainly not one corporation alone, can change that single-handedly. So I think in that sense, corporations, unlike government and civil society, are somewhat misplaced, at least in the way we have set them up, to contribute to a broader sustainability agenda. Of course, we are also witnessing in business schools, no less, an interesting debate about how to change the way we set up companies. Here at Copenhagen, there's a big debate and a big focal point in the debate on social innovation or social entrepreneurship, where we would say, let's think of a company as an entity that has economic goals, but also social or environmental goals. We have witnessed in the United States the rise of the benefit corporation, which is the legal equivalent to this idea of saying, let's hold a board accountable not just in terms of making profit, but also advancing a social and environmental agenda. And I think that's, of course, a very different way of thinking about a corporation. So I think the real progress with regard to the big issues, if we want to put corporations into this picture, we have to change the way we set them up. And in the business school context, we have to change the basic model of the firm we are teaching to our students. Because if we just teach it as an economic entity, it will always be only fit to achieve that. If we want corporations to do more with regard to sustainability, to leverage their resources, their knowledge to broader societal ends, we have to change the way we see their purpose in society. And that's the great challenge ahead for business schools, in my view. The question what drives this agenda in business school is not surprisingly very much a question that leads us to look at the students. You know, if you like, the customers. I don't like that word, but the people who run and for whom this institution is set up, the students. In my institution in Toronto, it is the agenda for sustainability is very much driven by students, because what we get more and more, certainly at our graduate level courses where we teach students who had already some time to work in business, that they come back and say, look, I want to do some work which is meaningful beyond just making money, making a career, having an interesting life in business. I want to do something which has a meaning beyond. So I think the students are a big driver. But of course, this can only work if faculty is tuned in. So we really need to also give these issues legitimacy within the curriculum, within the research agenda. And I think that's a very interesting way to do it, because if people do research on a topic, they are much more likely to mention it and to work on it in the classroom. And in that sense, I would say that giving good incentive for doing research in this area. And it is a new, fascinating field for business, could probably be another very strong driver of this agenda within schools. How to give good incentives for research, of course, go back to the way what drives people to pick and to get excited about certain research topics, right? I think a big part of it is the fact that now we see a quite developed space where you can publish, where you can talk, so journals, conferences, about these sustainability issues. And so, of course, that gives a strong incentive to researchers to go down that road. I think the other thing also is, of course, to give these issues more legitimacy, because business schools are relative conservative places. So this old model of the firm as just an economic actor is still very strongly ingrained into business school thinking and orthodoxy. So I think we need to see and show more leadership here to say there are different ways of thinking about business. the problems and the challenges of sustainability, but also the opportunities, are just too big to operate a model of the firm which can only ever capture part of it, rather than putting business front and center to this agenda. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think a conference like this one is a great stepping stone to give this issue more airtime and more legitimacy in a business school context.